Welcome to Season 2 of the Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdy Foundation. Join us as we uncover the art of giving back.
Welcome listeners, our special guest today is a philanthropic powerhouse and a passionate crusader for human rights, in particular for gender injustice all over the world. Jeremy Meltzer, founder of I=Change, has a fascinating story, and today he gives us an insight into the steps we can all take towards making a difference every day and how his expertise and experience expertly marries charitable enterprises, technology, consumerism and sustainability. Okay, so I=Change, it's the world's first cause marketing platform, Australia's fastest growing social enterprise tech startup. You won the Best Charity Initiative Finalist in 2021, won the Optus Innovator of the Year in 2019. You've given talks, you've given a TED talk on the importance of empowering women and girls. I=Change, it's all you, mate. You're a philanthropic powerhouse and incredible crusader for a whole raft of causes, including current major endemic issue we face globally around gender violence and injustice against women and girls. Welcome to the Hidden Philanthropist, Jeremy Meltzer.
Well, thank you. I think all these things sound lovely when they're read out. Ultimately, it's about the work, isn't it, and just doing your best work. But no, pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely, it's about the work, and you've done some amazing work, and I guess that's what today's about, is ultimately discussing I=Change, discussing the amazing work that you've done, and not only that, the amazing results that you've been able to achieve, because I think people set out, there's a saying that not everyone can do great things, but they can do small things with great love. You've managed to achieve great things, and that's a real achievement and something that you need to be acknowledged for, and that's what today's about. We'll get to that. We'll get to I=Change and what you've done. But I guess initially for me on my journey about learning about people like you and philanthropists and successful philanthropists, and for other people, there's a whole journey that leads up to getting to where ultimately you've got to today. What was life like for a young Jeremy? Where did you start out?
How far back do you want to go?
I mean, you've had this really esteemed career as a social activist and as a tech entrepreneur, but kid Jeremy, what was that like?
Oh, look, I was a bit different, I think. It's interesting, I was telling a really good friend of mine the other day about recalling being in kindergarten, and so you want me to be vulnerable, right? Yeah. Do you want me to warts and all? That's the idea.
It's warts and all.
So no, I just remember, and I'm sure we've all had these experiences to some degree, but I remember when I was in kindergarten where I definitely wasn't making a choice because I was 3. I didn't want to play with the boys because I wasn't interested in football, and I wanted to sit with the girls, and whatever they seemed to be talking about was more interesting than what the boys were talking about, and there was only so long they would let me sit with them before they said, you're not a girl, bugger off. And so I think I spent a lot of time alone as a child at school, and I remember feeling quite, you don't know what to do with that. You can't understand it. You're 3, you're 4, you're 5. And I remember the teacher buying me a special clock because she saw that I was good with my hands. I liked pulling things apart and rebuilding it, and I didn't seem to sort of fit into a particular group. And so I think that's become a strength of mine over time, when I've grown into my skin. And I think we can all remember that time of feeling clunky as young adults, and who are we, and what are we here for, and what's the best use of ourselves. And so it was what was a really challenging period, I think, socially, even in growing up in primary and high school. Over time it was fine because I became a long distance runner, and I was kind of, in Australia, if you're good at any sport, you kind of, you're accepted. And the fact that I was sensitive and didn't prescribe to sort of a version of masculinity which was dominant in those days and still is in many. It is changing, but still is in many respects a version of masculinity which is around toughness, not expressing your emotions, being good at football, and I just didn't see the point in that. And I think there's something in me knew that it wasn't authentic in the boys my age. I kind of felt that everyone was putting it on, even though I didn't have the language or understanding around it.
And although this went on to change for you at 3, because spending a short amount of time with you now, I mean, it comes across you come across as a very kind and very empathetic person. At 3, that's genetic behaviour, isn't it? That's not learnt behaviour at 3. This is sitting with the girls, the not fitting in with the boys. I mean, this is something that was ingrained in you from the start.
Yeah. I mean, I think my parents, without knowing it, they were very good in that there was no messaging around toughen up. There wasn't any of that nonsense, or don't cry, or be a man, or that crap, which is so damaging for young men, where they are told to not express the fullness of their emotions, where they are denied their sensitivity and their vulnerability and their tears, and they harden up. And that hardening up is an abuse against young boys, because it removes them at distances, it severs them from their heart. And that is terribly destructive. And arguably the state of the world today is, if it can only be a reflection of our consciousness, then it is a clear reflection of the extent to which we have severed men from their hearts. Because largely men have built the world we live in, and the systems and the structures and the patriarchy. And as we have been severed from that emotional sensitivity and that range, you could argue that the world is a direct expression and representation of the severing from men's sensitivity and emotional range.
So talking about that, you obviously, I take from that, you had a very nurturing and loving and caring upbringing. And we've talked about you on an emotional level at school. You've gone on to forge a career as a recognised, successful entrepreneur. Were you an intellect? You weren't a jock at school. Were you an intellect? Were you a smart student?
I was sort of a B student. Like, I didn't excel because I didn't care that much. I was just kind of like, this is mildly interesting, so I'll get by. But I enjoyed music, and I pursued a music career at one point, which I don't talk about much.
Obviously, wasn't hugely successful.
No. Well, it was actually in the US. But that I learned a lot from that, so we can talk about that if you'd like.
We're going to get to the US. Back here in Australia, through your formative years, I'm assuming now that we've had a brief talk about it, your parents had a huge influence on your life. In your school years, and I talk about primary school, secondary school, I don't know if you went on to do further study. You're in Cuba at 21. So who were some of the biggest influences in your formative years? I mean, a lot of these things that you've gone on to achieve have formed over time, but you obviously had a huge amount of it back in you in these early days. You weren't super sporty, you were a B student. Where did all this greatness come from? Who were your influences? Who were your mentors?
Well, if we're to explore the theme of sensitivity as an expression of, quote unquote greatness, then I would say that in those earlier years, it wasn't Gandhi, for example, right? I mean, the social conscience came later. Although, what I would again thank to my parents, and especially Mum, is that, instead of buying a new car, for example, she'd say, no, we're all going to Asia as a family. So we spent a lot of time in the developing world as kids. We used to go to Fiji a lot and spend time in the villages. And I remember traipsing through Southeast Asia, as a young teenager, 10, 12, 13, and always being very moved by the poverty that I saw. In fact, I remember being on a bus I was probably 15, I was by myself from Bombay, as it was called then, down to Goa, and driving through a slum area, and there was just this most extraordinary poverty, and I remember no one in the bus blinking an eye, and I'm looking around thinking, can you not see? Why am I the only person completely distressed by this? And I learned later that it's complex in Indian culture, and they see it and they've lived with it, and it's common and it's complex, and they don't know what to do with it. But as the foreigner, that was one of those early experiences of like, shit, there's hundreds of thousands of people barely subsisting. What is going on here? And so, but my early I was, there was a really romantic side of me, and I guess that's part of the sensitivity and the vulnerability. And I, moving out of high school, I did a Bachelor of Arts, and I focused on learning Spanish, and that took me off to, I decided, because I've always been a little bit sort of, I guess, adventurous, and so I thought, if I'm going to do this properly, I thought the sound of Cuba, living in Cuba for a while sounds a bit sort of like no one goes to Cuba, so let's go to Cuba, It sounds romantic, living in Havana. So I did, and I was 21, and that changed everything.
So this emotion in you, this sensitivity, this empathy that's now created a platform or created a conduit for you to really create change. I can't wait to talk about your time in Cuba, but I mean your exposure to poverty and your witnessing of these things that ultimately you would go on to create change happened well before that. You saw this at a young age throughout Asia with your parents.
Yeah, and we would spend time in villages and sleep in the homes of families. And what always struck me, I mean, I know it's a cliche, but it's very true, that some of the poorest people are not only some of the happiest in terms of the joy and the ability to be present, but they give more than they have. They give with an open heart. And I mean, you go to a Fijian village, they don't have much, and they'll make sure you sleep in the chief's house, and you take the chief's bed. And if you don't want the chief's bed, they get insulted. They're like, no, you sleep here, and you're our guest, and you eat first. And they barely have enough for themselves, some of these people. And so, what that asked was for deeper questions to be answered around what is it around the nature of privilege, the nature of abundance, that actually makes us hold on to the things we have so tight that we actually lose our connection to ourselves and our community. And of course, these poorer communities in the developing world live in communities. And so the connection to themselves and the reliance on each other and the understanding that they need each other to survive is in many cases what creates the happiness and the sense of purpose that actually we often miss out on in the developed world because of our conditioning, which is around, personal gratification and our careers and gathering things and
capitalist society
and developing wealth. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I mean, you could argue that the impact on the environment, is enormous, which is true. But it's just, I think as I get older, there's much less judgment, and it's more, hold on, we are all just a product of all that's happened to us from the moment of birth. And therefore, we can only operate from our awareness based on the experiences that we've had, most of which we didn't choose, right? Like you would have had things happen to you as a teenage boy or younger that probably informs your behaviour and your worldview even today. But largely we're often not aware, we're not conscious of it. And so doing that work to say, well, hold on, I was born, middle class, in Camberwell, loving parents. what's the privileged foundation that has enabled? And every day, I think I'm even more and more aware of not only the obvious privilege, but the layers of privilege. That as a white educated male, the doors that opened for me faster than almost anyone else is an extraordinary thing. And I think there's a deep responsibility that comes with that.
Watching you talk last night, had anyone ever asked me if I suffer from privilege, I would have said I think I'm fairly empathetic. I think I have an open view on everything. But the way that you put it about what privilege is, do I ever think about having to walk across the other side of the street because there's men further up on the same side of the road? Do I ever think about whether I should wear a short skirt or not a short skirt, or what time I need to leave and can I leave in it? All of these things, I realised I never think of any of those, and it really is privilege, isn't it? It's male privilege.
100%. And you can't know that because it's always been your experience. Like you and I can move through the world with a degree of confidence, late at night down most streets in this city, without thinking twice about it. Whereas for women, there's a dozen things that consciously it's like, okay, it's dark, I'm alone. Self-preservation is immediate, and that thought, and what do you have to do to stay safe? And the implications of that are enormous.
So we've touched on your childhood. 21's come along. I mean, you are who you are. But big things started to change, didn't they? You moved overseas, you went to Cuba, and things started to change. Talk about that.
Look, I went to Havana because, well, it sounded romantic. No one went there. And I thought, and I was singing at the time, right? I wanted to sing Spanish love songs. And so the bolero, which is the Latin love song, came out of Cuba. So I thought, that's the heartland, go to where it all began, right? I mean, it sounds ridiculous in hindsight.
Empathetic, sensitive, wants to sing Spanish love songs. Is this like every woman's dream man that I'm talking to today?
Well, I don't sing Spanish love songs so much anymore, so not really. but I gave it a good crack, right? So, I had 1 year of Spanish under my belt, and I moved to Havana to sing Spanish love songs because, again, there's the male privilege thinking I can do anything, right? So I thought, why not? No one else does that, so I'm going to give it a go. I wasn't interested in... I think I was always very aware of the path most people followed. It wasn't because it was an authentic choice for themselves. It was because everyone else was doing it. And I was really... And I still am. I'm very alert to kind of mob behaviour. And I think we're all, to an extent, guilty of following the mob. And even... It can be very subtle, like what our family's doing and what our community's doing and the expectations of culture. And how much are we actually making authentic decisions for who we deeply are? We've got one life. And we've got one crack at this. And so from a very early age, the idea of, like, for example, I'm planning a trip to PNG, right? We can talk about that later. But again, most people, it's not because most people don't go to PNG, it's because there's a really important story to tell out of PNG. But Havana at the time was, no one went. When I lived there for over 4 months, I didn't see another tourist. This was like in 1998. So I went to learn Spanish love songs. Instead, I met a Cuban woman and had a girlfriend. And through her, I met a lot of the community. And, of course, life had other plans. And what I started to hear and experience very quickly were stories of violence, from Cuban women, speaking about their husbands, partners and boyfriends. And every woman I met had a story. And they spoke about it as if it was the most normal thing in the world. And I thought, what the hell, what's going on here? Like, it was so kind of twisted that they actually saw it as an expression of love. It's like, he hits me because he's jealous, because he loves me. Because he's jealous of, Ramon looking at me a certain way, and then he hit me, but that's because he loves me. I'm like, this is so fucked up. Like, how is that not only deeply, dysfunctional expression of love, but the fact that a woman is being conditioned to believe that that's somehow normal and natural. And so I left Havana and then I moved to Miami, where I lived for 3 years. And again, almost every woman I met had a story. And so at that same time, the goal of pursuing music started to seem quite vacuous. And I'd been meeting a lot of people in the music industry and realized how deeply unimpressed I was with actually who they were as individuals, as human beings. And I thought, why am I pursuing something that is, I have no control over my career, because at that time the industry was like run by 10 people and it was a very disempowering place to be in. I'm not impressed with the humans I'm meeting. It's superficial at best a lot of the time. And actually, like I can hold a tune, but there's far better singers of Spanish love songs out there in the world, and they probably come from Spanish-speaking countries, right, to start with. Right? So I thought, there's probably something else I should be doing with my life. And I went through it was probably one of the darkest periods in my life of about 6 months where I'm like, and I think for men, we struggle when we are uncertain of our identity, when we are not sure of where to put our roots into the soil. And, I'd been so kind of defined by this idea of I'm going to sing Spanish love songs, as ridiculous as that sounds in hindsight. It was, I was passionate and I was committed and I would let nothing stop me. And then it's like, okay, what am I going to do? So that led to the next stage of life.
What was the next stage of life?
Well, I knew that I wanted to understand these issues that were holding back women and girls from their potential. I wanted to learn more about gender and gender-based violence, and the constructs of gender and the systems and beliefs that ultimately led to gender-based violence. I wanted to start a business. I wanted to become entrepreneurial. I had that in my blood. My parents have been entrepreneurial their whole life. I had no idea how these worlds could come together. But at the time, so we have a little property in Yellingbo, which is about an hour from here, and Dad had planted olive trees, and they were fruiting for the first time. It takes several years, and I remember in my kind of misery around what am I going to do with my life, I wandered into a food store and I saw there was no Australian olive oil. This is in New York. So the idea of being the first Australian olive oil in the US actually started to feel exciting. It's like, okay, well, no one's done this before. There's Australian wine. There's no Australian olive oil. Could we be the first? And what would that look like? And so I moved back to Melbourne. We developed a brand. And I spent the next several years going back and forth to the States, doing dozens of trade shows and harassing distributors and retailers. And eventually we sort of got a little segment on the Martha Stewart show.
Do you know what? I was about to say, for the Spanish love songs, you must have always had an element of performer in you, because I know a little bit about the journey with your olives.
Right.
Because I saw your performance on the Martha Stewart show. Didn't you hit that out of the park? What a classic. When I watched that, I thought you're an entertainer.
You know what was funny? The plan for that show was it was Valentine's Day, and the producer said, oh, look, come on the show, cook with your olive oil, and then we want you to serenade Martha. Right?
It was absolutely brilliant.
But because it was live television and the segment started late and they went straight to the ad break and I didn't get to sing to Martha, and I was so heartbroken. I thought my big break, was never going to happen. And it was just like, I thought, Martha, I was about to sing to you. What happened? She said, oh, well, we had to go to ad break. And I thought my life was over, right? Like that.
When I saw you do the TED Talk, I mean, I was super impressed by what an incredible speaker you were, but I had realised that you obviously had it in you from quite a young age, because it was quite funny watching you on the Martha Stewart show.
Thank you. Well, I had to sort of ad-lib a bit. So, look, we had some success, right, in the US with the olive oil, but I never stopped in all the trips to the US, to the developing world, back and forth from Australia. I started meeting with NGO leaders. And
what's for the listeners? What's an NGO?
A non-government organisation. So they are effectively not-for-profits who are committed to solving a social or environmental issue. NGOs tend to be larger in size, and they get funding from a variety of different sources, from grants, foundations, private philanthropy, governments. And they're generally the most established of those sort of the not-for-profits.
And in a really short snippet, how does an NGO differ from a normal not-for-profit?
Well, not-for-profits can exist for a whole variety of issues, like, the sausage sizzle at the RSL Club can be a not-for-profit. So they're generally they're focused on social and environmental issues, and they exist for a very specific cause.
So you've started meeting with the leaders or the heads of these NGOs. What did that look like?
Yeah, well, I met with NGOs working on women's empowerment, and what I realised was, this was several years before Me Too, this will become one of the defining issues of our time, because this was the early stages in the data was emerging, showing that when you educate girls, when you protect women and girls from violence, when you ensure they don't get married off as teenagers, when you enable them to realise their potential, whole communities thrive exponentially. For example, if a girl is, if a woman is able to start her own business, if she's supported through microfinance, for example, is one mechanism, she will invest in the developing world up to 90% or more of what she earns back into her family, back into her child's education. And as a woman, she will tend to then give the same thing to her daughter as she will her son. When a man earns money, he will generally spend about 40% on the family and the rest on himself. Now, these are sort of fairly damning statistics in terms of really the impact on community. So what it effectively shows is that when you unlock the entrepreneurial potential of women, when you invest in their skills, and when that then flows on to the next generation, whole communities thrive. And there's a Chinese saying which became a book, Women Hold Up Half the Sky, which you might have heard of, which was written by Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times journalist, and his wife, Karen Wu Dun, around this realization that around the developing world, women must be empowered if we are to create stable and prosperous communities. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying I was meeting with NGOs, and they were all talking about, wow, we have to invest in women and girls. And that's an area I'd become passionate about. And so what this left me was, okay, how do we bring these two worlds together? So Dad and I were running this kind of scrappy olive oil business, harassing journalists and retailers and distributors, and running myself ragged back and forth to the US. But always I had this knowing that it wasn't enough, that making money would never be enough, that if I sold 1 million olive oil bottles every month, it actually wouldn't make me much happier or any happier than if we sold 1,000 olive oil bottles a month. And I remember thinking, is there something wrong with me that I actually don't care that much? It's satisfying to build a business. Absolutely, I get that. It's something to be enormously proud of. But it just became apparent to me young of age that growing a business to make money alone would not be enough.
Can I say that I absolutely understand how you feel? It didn't happen to me as young as you, but that is exactly what I'm going through in the last year or two, is that I've reached this point in my career where ultimate corporate success is not what I measure success by anymore, and it's not fulfilling, and making lots of money is not fulfilling. And you said earlier, life is short and you have one crack, and you need to make the most of it, and you need to find what success looks like for you, because making lots of money isn't what success is for a lot of people, and that's what you found.
Well,
or maybe not. It's not fulfilling or as fulfilling as you would imagine it would be.
Look, no one wants the stress of not having enough money, but of course we know, the cliche of the miserable millionaire, right, or billionaire is true, because unless you have the things that matter, which is culture, community, connection, and a good meal, there's not a lot else that matters, and obviously your health. And so we've kind of been hoodwinked into a version of success which is not only destroying the planet, it hasn't perhaps unlocked the best of us. And what could the best of us be? I think, like what an incredible journey you're on, right? To, your success in business and now wanting to give back and wanting to celebrate people who are doing this kind of work and doing it yourself. I'm heartened because I've met a lot of young philanthropists who are inheriting fortunes, who are wanting to do good work with it. They're not wanting to buy boats and planes. They see the ridiculousness for what it is and the sort of absurdity, and they're like, no, how do we put this money to impact people and planet? How do we look at this through the lens of impact investments and using capital as a force for good? And so, we've uniquely in our own way bridged that world between business and impact. But it's an exciting space, and there's a lot happening in this space now. And of course, we are in a very critical period for our species, and that's not hubris anymore. And so we definitely need to accelerate these efforts and for more of us to be doing more of this work in this really fragile time.
Okay, so you're running a successful olive oil business. You've realised that it's now time to start looking down or venturing down the path of finding success in different areas, down the philanthropic path. I equal change. Was it a light bulb moment? Was it something that you'd been thinking of on the journey that you'd been on whilst in Cuba, whilst seeing the things that had influenced you over your journey to date, or did it just come to you?
It came to me at 3 a.m. I was in New York, and I'd been meeting with NGOs, and they all needed more money to do their work. And I just realised, selling a million bottles of olive oil wouldn't satisfy me. And I'd seen these early versions of, call it cause marketing or CSR, where brands would say, do you want to round up $1, or we're going to sell, give away X, or do you want to? And it always seemed almost insulting when I think, as a consumer, we were asked to make a donation at the point of sale, because we all know we buy something from a brand, they're making money, and then they're asking us to make a donation. It's like, well, hold on. Why? Where's your skin in the game? Shouldn't you be giving back? You've just made money from me, and I would feel much better about my purchase if I knew you were giving back. And so the idea I had was to flip the model, where it was a simple idea. What if we gave back $1 from every olive oil bottle that we sold online? And what if our customers could choose where it goes? And how much money could we raise, and what would the impact be on the business? So all answers to those questions, I had no idea, zero tech background. And that sparked me on this really stubborn journey, to which I remain stubborn, to not only build a platform, but prove how this is actually good for business. So looking at this through an entrepreneurial lens of being able to talk to businesses and tell them, look, yes, you care, and yes, your customers care, and yes, especially now, you must be doing something like this. When we started several years ago, it was a hell of a slog to get the first brand on board. But what we did find is we tested this on the Yellingbo olive oil site, and we saw like an 11% increase in conversions, all these fantastic mentions across social media. And I thought, oh shit, if we've built this and our customers are responding and it's enabling us to differentiate in a really meaningful way, could we turn this into a platform that other businesses could use? Could this be scalable? And that was the genesis of the idea.
You answered a question already for me, but I want to ask it anyway, because you're recognised as an incredible philanthropist, but you're also recognised as a tech entrepreneur. I was going to ask, is it the philanthropy that drives the tech, or is it the tech that drives the philanthropy? But it's very much the philanthropy that drives the tech, isn't it?
Yeah, the vision was a user experience which was 100% transparent. And when brands did this previously, and even today, they'll say, we give 1% of proceeds. Like, what does that mean? No one knows what that means. It's almost meaningless. It's a nice thing to have on the back page of a website. The whole idea of this was to build tech that reflected an authentic commitment to creating change as a business. So the way the platform works, it pops up post-purchase, it engages every customer, brands give $1, or more or less, but it's a clear amount, and most of our brands do give that $1. We all know what it is, and then as a customer, I can choose where it goes. I can track the impact, which leads to what we call a live giving page on our site, and to see in real time how much it's raising and where it's going. So the tech very much reflects the vision for an authentic philanthropic experience.
Was it hard to get buy-in at the start from the corporates?
Yeah, it was almost impossible. I mean,
because they're not driven by philanthropic cause, they're driven being answerable to shareholders and a balance sheet. So I would imagine it's really hard to get them to understand the benefits of doing what you're doing, because ultimately, like you experienced with your olive oil business, this is coming from the businessman inside of me. Like, I mean, you're doing fantastic things, and let's recognise it for the fantastic things that you're doing. But a byproduct of that is that your business booms and you start becoming more profitable, and your bottom line looks a whole heap better anyway. So you would think that it would be a really easy sell, but I don't reckon it would be.
You're right, and it's not, and it wasn't, and it still isn't to some degree. It's getting easier. The headwinds now are inflation and interest rates, and people just buying less stuff, and therefore, one of the first things to go for a lot of businesses is like, that giving program, our commitment, our CSR, which is, a real challenge, because this is the time that we need businesses to be stepping up more than ever, to become and remain good corporate citizens, so that there are communities that can afford their products. I mean, it's really about, stabilizing and developing the community that are your customers, and also continuing to earn that social license to operate, which is a really key thing today. So absolutely, I mean, it was bloody hard. I'm like, okay, we've got data from our little olive oil business. So I knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew the woman who owns 9 West in Australia, the shoe store. So I managed to harass someone for her number, and I called and left a message. And I said, look, we don't know each other, but I know so-and-so, blah, blah. I've got this idea. Would you like to trial it on your site? And to her credit, she called me back and she said, yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to give back from every shoe sale. And so 9 West was, we were very fortunate to work with them for the first few years, and they stuck with us while we kind of worked out what we're doing and made mistakes and took learnings and got data from the transactions. And that then enabled us to slowly open doors to other brands. But as I said, I mean, even today we are working on being very much a data-driven solution. So we're talking to businesses. Basically, we talk to businesses through the lens of digital marketing. This is how it's going to help you meet your growth metrics, so that they can then commit to the giving, which then creates the impact. So, from the beginning, we've never said do this because it's a nice thing to do. Ultimately, these decisions need to get past CEOs and CFOs, and so, we're very pragmatic in that respect. We know we must speak the language of business in order to be speaking with the largest companies in Australia, which we are, so that their commitment to people and planet is one that can be ongoing.
And it's that entrepreneur and the philanthropist. Like, there's something really beautiful about the purity of you going in and doing what you're doing. Like, you're going in there and demonstrating them a platform that they can create greater consumer engagement with their brand and increase their bottom line. But you're actually doing it for a good reason, and you're taking that money. It funnels down through into I=change. And we'll talk about that next. So because it's so involved and it is complex, and you've put all this work into it, but on a really, really simplified level, you've created a platform, or you've created a tech, an ability where big businesses sign up, people get online, they buy something from the company, and the company donates $1 to an NGO that you've done research on and basically certified from your level. And that's how it works.
That's basically it. On the thank you page, post-purchase, there's a platform that appears. The brands choose 3 projects, and you as a customer get to choose where to send their $1 to one of 3 projects. You can add $1 of your own, a couple of bucks if you wish to, after making that choice. And that's it. And then we give the businesses the messages and tools so that across that customer journey, consumers know that brand gives back. Increasingly, the I Equal Change brand is effectively a stamp. You are a brand giving back from every sale. And what's exciting is how much customers are responding. Like we're seeing, it's interesting, not only is it reducing what they call abandoned cart, like apparently it's a bit of a national sport in Australia. We have one of the highest rates of abandoned cart, of 76% of all Australians. We put things in the cart online and we don't buy it. Right? A few hands up in the room.
My wife buys everything that goes in the cart.
Well, yeah, it's a dangerous sport, isn't it? Once you start buying everything. But we all love to get to that point. And then there's that sense of, and this is where consumer psychology comes in. It's like, most of what we buy we don't need, right? So do I want it? Do I need it? Do I want to spend the money? And what we're seeing is that when the customer has been engaged to know that if they check out, their purchase will create change, that it's going, part of that purchase will go back and they'll get to choose. It shifts that whole purchase decision from head to heart. And it even subconsciously alleviates some of the guilt. Now, this is not to say we shouldn't all be shopping less as a society, right? There's all sorts of impacts in that. But as long as people are going to shop, what we see our role is in taking businesses on that relatively early stage journey of accelerating their sustainability. And part of that is absolutely giving back to people and planet. And as you say, we vet and we visit the NGO partners. We're really careful about who we partner with, which is a big part of that value add of, we can talk about this if you like. I just got back from Cambodia working with our anti-trafficking partner, and we're gathering these stories of change, we call it, from those first-person beneficiaries to really bring to life the impact, right? Because we've now raised almost $7.5 million, $1 at a time.
What I was about to say is I understand that you're very much a balance of the two. But so we put a line right down the middle of entrepreneur and philanthropist. The entrepreneur in you enable you to create this funnel. Let's call it a funnel. It's a funnel that now brings a substantial amount of money down into your philanthropic cause, which is I Equal Change. That's where the magic happens. What does I Equal Change then go and do with the money? Because that's what you're about to talk about.
So it's all very transparent and democratic. So as a customer, if you check out from, let's say, National Tiles, you choose where to send their dollar, and then every quarter we pay out 100% of those donations to those projects. Yeah, so 100% of funds, and that's also part of our commitment to making as much impact, is working out a simple model so that from every dollar, 100% of that goes through to the NGO.
Is there an internal conflict with you where you've got one side of this vehicle that's trying to stimulate and market and make e-commerce happen, and yet as much as you've got all these amazing causes with anti-violence and injustice against women and kids, another one of your causes is climate change, and they are very much conflicted, aren't they?
In terms of we just need to shop less.
We need to shop less on one side of it, but on the other side, we really want them to shop more because it's creating more money to go down to that funnel to I Equal Change.
Yeah, there's the world's full of contradictions, right?
Absolutely.
And absolutely, we all need to buy less stuff and to live simpler. And the great irony is living simpler actually makes people happier and decluttering. But I don't know if we have the power to make people not shop, and we have been conditioned to buying things. And there's certain things we're always going to need to buy, like food. So if we're going to shop, let it then be from a brand that gives back. Let it then be from a business that is committed to being a force for good. And our job is to make it not only simple for the businesses, but we're now turning our website into a destination where you can find and shop those brands, like a marketplace, like a store directory, kind of like Afterpay, where you know all those brands, you can split your payment. This one is arguably a more exciting or empowering experience where you know that each of those brands, and some of them are, some of the most recognised brands now, are giving back from every sale. And if we can then create a new channel and actually be driving traffic back to the brands, it's another value proposition which we can deliver to those retailers to again make their giving even more sticky, more valuable, and deepen their commitment.
Have you got a big team? And I'm not talking now from a conflicted position. I'm just talking as a time split. So you've got this journey where you're going out there and you're engaging with big corporates. You're pushing your agenda, which is a brilliant agenda. You're then focused on funneling the corporate dollar down into I equal change. But or you're not actually, well, yeah, you're trying to funnel the corporate dollar down from the business to the NGO. But at the same time, you've got to be out there pushing the NGO's cause to try and get consumer engagement with the corporate. Have you got a big team?
No, I mean, it was me for several years, kind of banging away and trying to work things out. We're almost 7 people now, kind of 6 to 7, not all full time. So, yeah, that was a great challenge. Just getting the right team. I mean, what's wonderful is, the team we have are brilliant and they're passionate, and it's to this day it's so heartening how, like, I think all of us are wanting to work for purposeful businesses. We're wanting to, I mean, we hear about this all the time now, like in order for, and we're noticing this is one of the value adds for businesses who are giving back through us, are able to say to their team, it helps in terms of that talent war, right? In retaining great staff, to be able to transparently show their commitment to the community. So it's, that's been also a win in terms of we've attracted some great people who are passionate about what we do. Okay,
you said before about the team and how wonderful they are. The most wonderful thing for me is what you do with the money once it comes through the funnel to I equal change. What does I equal change do? Let's talk about all these incredible photos on the wall, your journey post understanding how you're going to go and raise all this money, because you've raised a lot of money, $7.5 million more.
Almost 7.5.
Almost $7.5 million. Like, that's a lot of money. What do you go and do with the money? How do you get it to the coalface of the problems? And what are the problems that you're out there to fix, and the causes that you're there to partner up with?
Yeah. So I'll make one thing really clear. The hero in this story is firstly the NGOs, who are organisations full of incredibly dedicated, passionate people who are not there, not making fantastic salaries. They're there because they deeply care. And those impact leaders who are out on the ground or in the field every day working with communities. Creating change is a really difficult thing to do. And I'll tell you 2 stories. So effectively, we funnel those funds, 100% of it, to the NGOs, a whole range of issues from ending violence against women, to girls' education, to mental health, to also children and families experiencing cancer in Australia. There's a shelter, which is one of our most funded projects, a women's community shelter, they're called, for women and children escaping domestic violence, or let's call it what it is, men's violence against women. And now also we've partnered with some environmental NGOs like World Wildlife Fund, like Greening Australia, like CBIN. So I'll illustrate this with 2 quick stories. Just my last trip before COVID, I was in Bangladesh with the Hunger Project, and Dr. Badiul is a Bangladeshi social impact leader. He's been working on the issue of ending the marriage of girls for 40 years. And even today, he goes out into the villages and he meets with the male leaders in those communities, and he schmoozes with them, and he talks to them about, when you don't marry off your daughters as 14-year-olds, here's the impact on your entire community. These girls become educated, they become leaders, they make more money, which is good for the family, which is good for the community. They have smaller children. There's no religious reason, except it's become cultural that you marry off your daughter, so therefore we can change it. And so, but it's complex, and he's been going to these communities for 30 years and talking to these leaders and working with families and individuals, and in the back of jeeps in dusty places in the middle of nowhere, and it's not, to change the hearts and minds of people is not easy. And it takes deep commitment and a lot of sweat. And incredible to see the enthusiasm of this guy who's now in his 70s. He had the energy of a 30-year-old. He's bouncing around in these cars, and he said to me, he turns, he said, "Jeremy, you know what the answer is? You never accept no. When someone says no, you just come at them with another creative angle until they say yes, and they don't even know what you've done, and they hear themselves saying yes. Just never accept no." I said, "Oh, it's good to be reminded of that," and I saw him, people were calling him with problems, and he just sort of, a bit like a sort of a Zen master, he just sort of fixed it all sort of on the fly, from the back of the Jeep, and made stuff happen, and because he knew that it was the right thing to do. And he knew it was the wrong thing to do for girls to be married off at the age of 13, 14, 15. I just got back 2 weeks ago from Cambodia, and I'll never forget it. In all these trips, there's always one person that I think sort of etches themselves into my heart that I will never forget. And for me, it was the last night in Siem Reap, when we went out with Hagar International, which is our anti-trafficking partner in the field. And we walked into a little hut, and it's a family living almost in the dirt. I mean, we're talking $1 to $2 a day, 1 or 2 meals a day of very basic sort of rice and vegetables, and met this really super sweet and very, very vulnerable young woman who started telling us her story. And she, at the age of 14, went to what she thought was Thailand so she could earn. People earn on average about 50% more in Thailand than they do in Cambodia, so that she could send money home, right? She found herself in a forced marriage in China. And she doesn't speak the language. She's 14 years old. She's being sexually abused by this man. She's being physically abused by the mother-in-law, which is apparently quite common because of the power dynamic. She found a way to escape. She was picked up by the police. They took her back home. The word that was translated to me was that she was then tortured by the family. She then ended up working in a shoe factory where she met another Cambodian girl, finally someone she could communicate with. They plotted a way to escape. They did. Again, found by the police. She was then put in jail for 6 months. And when she was released from jail, they flew her back to Phnom Penh. And when I was sitting with her 2 weeks ago, she'd been back in Cambodia for only 6 weeks. She'd been gone for 5 years. Her family thought she was dead. And as you can imagine, she was deeply traumatized by her experience. So, again, the point is to highlight, the heroes here are, not only the survivors of these situations who have been through what, most of us can't even imagine. We've impacted the lives we know of up to about 1.5 million people, and everyone has a story. And to be clear, a lot of this work is in Australia. There's a lot of need in Australia. We were on the ground in Lismore really quickly working with our partners Thread Together and Food Bank to provide food and new clothing to communities who had lost everything. We've got a lot of work through our partners that we're doing in Australia as well. I guess I personally have a passion for the developing world because I see how far the money goes. And we're talking about people living not in relative poverty. That's not to take away from the struggles that a lot of Australians are experiencing, especially now. But when you're living on $1 or $2 a day, you're at a whole different level of need and urgency, and you're in survival mode. And so, again, the heroes are not only the people who are surviving through these experiences, but the NGOs who are doing the work on the ground and who are deeply committed to helping not only like, for example, that young woman, she needs firstly psychosocial support, like absolutely, access to trained counsellors, regularly, basic things like food support for her and her family, and they're training her to become like a beautician, which to give her skills training, right? So she can stay within the community, she can be skilled, she can feel proud. And what's heartbreaking, it was interesting, talking to her, like she didn't believe. Like she'd been so stripped of all confidence because of her experience, she didn't believe she even had the skills not to take away the skills of being a beautician, But, simple things like applying makeup, she didn't believe she could do that. She didn't have anyone, we spoke about this. There was no mentors to say, you can do this, you're smart. Let me introduce you, let me help you. She'd been so stripped of self-belief and confidence and was had lived through such harrowing experiences that something as relatively simple as putting makeup on someone, she didn't believe she could learn how to do. And, I said to the guy the NGO, I said, you've got to just tell her that she can do it. We need to bring other people here who are the survivors to show her this woman who could possibly still become anything. She's 19. And it just struck me again, how fortunate I am, and I think all of us. I'm sure we've all had people in our lives who've sparked something in us, who've shown us something that we can't see in ourselves as a young person and made us believe that we can do anything. And that is, that's the oxygen, that's the wind beneath your wings, right? When you have an elder or someone you look up to say to you, you can do it, I believe in you, I'm going to help you. And they don't want anything except for you to be your best self. Now that is a little silver bullet in someone's life, and many people around the world don't have that.
And these aren't isolated cases, are they? We talked about statistics earlier in developing countries. This is everywhere, isn't it? I mean, there is so much of this happening. You talked about the particular girl that you caught up with, but there is so much of it happening.
Look, it is. I mean, I also don't want to paint a story where, the developing world is miserable. I mean, it's also full of, look at Thailand. These are absolute, economic tigers, and there's a lot of wealth in these countries now. And there's these extraordinary things. I mean, there's so much dynamism in Southeast Asia, for example, even across Africa. I was in Rwanda, for example, a few years ago, and we support a school for girls. And it's an interesting case study, right? Because Rwanda, the soul of the country was destroyed. 10% of the population had been killed in 100 days, macheted to death, almost 1 million people. And it's not to say that the current presidency there's issues, but yet when Paul Kagame came in, he recognized that in order to heal this nation that has just experienced one of the worst genocides in 21st century, we need to actually empower women to rebuild the country. And so, most people never even heard of Rwanda. It's this tiny landlocked country in East Africa, right? And in 1993, it was suddenly thrust onto the world map because of this horrendous genocide. What's happened is that in the last 30-odd years, women have stepped up, and it's actually an incredible case study in what happens when you let women build a country, because the country was effectively destroyed. There's now more women in parliament than any country in the world. There's more women per capita in the public and private sectors compared to men than any country in the world. And what's happened? It's become the fastest growing economy in the world. It's the seventh fastest growing economy in the world. It's become the fastest growing economy in Africa. You might want to check those figures, but they're the figures that I heard only a couple of years ago. And it's become, if not the safest, one of the safest countries in Africa to walk around. And we were walking around Kigali late at night, feeling completely safe. Now, to consider there was a genocide where there was 1 million people lying on streets and being killed across the country, it's extraordinary. It's a country now full of incredible enthusiasm and a lot of young people who are being educated. And, it's just testament to the human spirit and our resilience and the fact that, yes, there's a lot of terrible things happening, but at the same time, there's a lot of extraordinary people. And, when you unlock people's intelligence and give them the capacity to unleash that, entrepreneurially, to build businesses, to become professionals, you raise up countries incredibly quickly. But at the same time, you can't hope to do that without the full inclusion of women. Cultures and religions and belief systems. Look at what's happening in Afghanistan. How can this country be anything but sent back to the Middle Ages if you deny girls education, if you don't allow them to go to school. I mean, recently they're trying to revert it to some degree, but the NGO sector, which is so, I think there's about a third to a quarter of all Afghans now relying on the NGOs for basic staples like food. And the Taliban has said women are not allowed to work in NGOs. NGOs are typically full of women. Now, again, it's just like it's extraordinary. I mean, how, and again, only men ultimately come up with this shit, right? To believe that somehow, women need to be hidden away from public life and diminished and denied education and kept at home. I mean, how any of that in people's minds can be not only invented but justified and maintained. And, ultimately I think the elephant in the room is we are fearful of women's power. We are fearful of their strength. We are fearful of the sexual power they have over us, a lot of men feel. And unless we see women as equals, and unless we walk alongside them as true allies, and we see that when women rise, we all rise. It's not a zero-sum. It's not a hyper-competitive world. That is an expression of the male mind. We are not going to ultimately solve the great challenges of our time, which is the empowerment of women and girls and climate change.
It leads me right into my next question, because you do all these amazing things overseas in developing countries. I saw you do a talk where you asked to put your left arm up if you've got a daughter, your right arm up if you've got a sister, your knee up if you've got a mother. I've got one of each of them. And statistically, 30%, 1 in 3 women will become victims of sexual or physical violence. And that's really, that blows me away. That's really scary. And that's not overseas, that's in our own backyard. Overseas, you're at the coalface of protecting women from that. And you are here as well. But how much of your energy and how much of your resources need to go in to, rather than protecting women from it, but actually fixing the problem, which is educating men?
It's a great question. So we support a couple of organisations. One is the Man Cave. Hunter Johnson, another great guy I suggest you have a chat with, who is doing exactly that, going into schools around Australia and working with young men to help redefine what it means to be a man. Because you're right, like we will be having the same conversation 500 years from now unless men become active agents of change, unless we become part of the solution. I mean, we have International Women's Day coming up, and part of this whole platform was came out of me going to these events and thinking, where are the men? And it's funny, I went to Women's Day, in International Women's Day events, and I think they were suspicious. They're like, oh, what, are you here to pick up women? Why are you here in this room? I said, no, I just want to learn. Like, can I just sit here quietly in the back? And because there were no men, I thought, this is not a place for just women. This is a place for humanity. Women's issues, quote unquote, are men's issues. They're human issues. They're human rights issues. And unless men, the thing is, as men, we're not aware of our privilege, and so we kind of see it as something that women have been working on. And I think, I sort of get annoyed when men say, and complete respect to you, because you make the absolute correct point. Like, we all many of us have either a mother, sister, or daughter, or all three, right? But if we didn't have either a mother, sister, or daughter, we should still feel the same way. We shouldn't have to look in our daughter's eyes to care about women's rights. We should know, because we do, because there's women everywhere, because they're half the population, that they could have been our sister. And in fact, genetically, we are all connected. We're all related. And the illusion of separation is an illusion. And it shouldn't just be about our immediate family and our circle of empathy, because actually that's not the way we've lived for hundreds of thousands of years. We've lived in communities of maximum about 150 people where we all relied on each other. And the health and well-being of everyone in our community was dependent upon the health and well-being of everyone in that community, and therefore we took care of a greater circle of humanity. And it's a great loss to all of us that we live in streets and we don't know our neighbours anymore, and we're all poorer because of it.
So we've talked about, and time is all of our greatest enemy, because we just can't be everywhere and we can't be in different places at once. For you've got these NGO partners that do wonderful things. You're a beautiful person. You're a wonderful mind, but you're a fantastic public speaker. Surely for you now, and I say celebrity speaker, but I mean a public circuit speaker that can go and engage and communicate on a level that you can. Surely education must be high on your agenda for you moving forward. Do you plan to do more speaking?
Yeah, to do more speaking is something I look forward to. I think at the core of the message is around all of us being of service in this time, and it doesn't need to be anything dramatic. It can just be. I'm kind of, like looking at. I think COVID is an interesting example where the party stopped, and we were immediately confronted by a visceral threat to our own well-being, and we changed our behaviours from one day to the next in ways that we never thought would be possible because we had to. And it's almost like, 15 odd million people have died and the party started again and we're back to distracting ourselves with nonsense. And I don't mean that to sound as judgmental as it probably sounds. Like, I think there is something innate to the human condition where we need to sort of, because the problems of the world seem so big, we need to just sometimes, talk crap, right? And just enjoy life. And I'm all for that. We need to go out and sometimes just, gossip, for example. But we also, and here's the irony of it and the kicker, it's that when people become connected to a bigger sense of themselves, when they find that thing that enables them to give back and to use whatever unique skills and talents and time or treasure that they may have for a greater purpose, it lights them up. And I've seen it time and time again. And again, the NGO leaders, they're not there for the money. They're there because they're helping change people's lives, and that gives them a deep sense of meaning and purpose. And so we are living in an urgent time. So if the message is anything, it could be simply distilled down to, what is that unique thing that moves you? I mean, one of the questions we've been asking people for our International Women's Day campaign, Shop for Change, is what do you care about? What matters to you? And the call to action is you can be the change when you shop for change. So spreading that message around, if you're going to buy from a brand that gives back, and inspiring people to, in this really fragile time on the planet, it's a time that I believe is calling of all of us to step up, to step outside of the human drama, which we largely create. We like to think it happens to us, but mostly we manifest it, and engage in something that actually contributes to being part of the solution.
With everything that you do, there needs to be a degree of normality about your life. What do you do to remove yourself from the tragedy and the sadness that you see around the world? There's got to be a normal Jeremy too. And I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, what do you do outside of the foundation?
You mean, do I sing Spanish love songs still?
Do you still sing Spanish love songs or make olive oil or...
Well, I helped out. Well, probably not as much as he would like with the with the olive oil. Look, I probably work a bit more than I should. I exercise, meditate, try to spend time in nature, and that's pretty normal, isn't it?
I guess so.
Yeah. I eat.
You sleep.
I cook. I cook
Mate,
healthy food.
You said earlier in the podcast, we have one life, we have one crack at it. From everyone that you've helped and that you've affected and that you've had an influence on, thank you very much for having a crack at it. You're an incredible person, and I'm honoured to have you on the podcast.
Oh no, thank you for having me. And again, I'm just, I'm not. This is not sort of a fake humility. I really believe I'm just simply trying to, whatever the best use of me is, and I think that's ultimately the question. And the heroes here is, we're creating the funding, which creates the impact. And so, you know, we're bridging worlds and we're a piece of the puzzle. And I think that's the question, is being, how can we all be a more meaningful piece of the puzzle?
Today's all about you, though, and the reality is you brought it all together and created it, so well done.
Thank you. Thanks.
To learn more about the art of giving back in whatever way you can, visit our website andrewpurdy.com.au and follow us on Instagram, The Hidden Philanthropist. Thank you for listening to The Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdy Foundation.